everybody. It's Maynard. It's Tuesday afternoon. It's time for Close of Business. Well, I know I say this every week. It sounds like I'm prone to exaggeration. I'm not. This is the greatest thing we've ever attempted today. We've got 4 guests, each one of which could have been an entire show. They graciously agreed to come together and form a choir to talk about what is one of the biggest issues I think we're all facing, but nobody's really talking about, which is if we're going to do all these things with electric vehicles and renewables and batteries and everything that the world wants to happen and is projecting to happen, there are some very practical considerations around that. Namely, where do you get the minerals and the metals to do all that stuff? Let me quickly introduce the panel because they're, as I say, this is the NBA dream team when it comes to minerals and metals. We've got Julian Kettle. He's from WoodMac. He's the vice chair of metals and mining. He's been doing it for 30 plus years. He's a renowned expert, particularly in metals, aluminum, copper, etc. We also have Assistant Secretary Frank Fannin from the Department of State. He, as a part of the government's effort to look into the geopolitical implications of the energy transition, it's something he's thought quite a lot about. He and his team will hear what the government is thinking. Frank's background is also he was at BHP, so he certainly understands many of the issues that we're facing in energy. We also have Dr. Rod Eggert. He's the chair in mineral economics at the Colorado School of Mines. He's been there since 1986. He's just a renowned expert in the field. Awfully excited to have you, Dr. Eggert. And last but certainly not least, our old friend, Mark Mills. Mark's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a renowned author. He's done a lot of great work in the field, published in many areas, and we just couldn't have any fun with minerals and metals without having you, Mark. So thank you to the 4 of you. Guys, as you prepare to get into this robust discussion, let's do a real quick around the horn. Mike Bradley, what's going on in the markets today? What do we need to know?
What we've got is crude oil is kind of stuck here in the low 40s a barrel, WTI, and it's the same thing we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. People are concerned with the election, virus response, et cetera, et cetera. But the good news is tonight we'll probably see a nice draw in crude oil inventories, or tomorrow in the DOE crude oil inventories. But the bigger issue the market's trying to get a handle on is what does Libya look like over the next couple of months? They're probably at 250 to 300,000 barrels flowing today. That's going to probably 500 or 600 within the next 3, 4, 5 weeks. And how does OPEC respond to that? And OPEC is going to be meeting in the next 7 to 10 days on that on their monthly meeting. And so right now the sentiment is pretty bad. But what I'd say is I'm getting more bullish. And the reason I'm getting more bullish is because I think the sentiment on crude oil and the equities is about as bad as I've seen it. Crude oil, most expectations, and if you look at the strip, is low 40s on the 12 and 24-month strip on crude oil. And if you look at what energy equities are dialing in, they're dialing in sub $40 crude. I think it's going to be in the low 50s next year, maybe mid 50s. And so I think there's fantastic value here, but no one really wants to do anything through year end. I think it's now time to be thinking about getting more on the offensive rather than being on the defensive. And that's the message we're sending to clients.
All right, you heard it here, Mike Bradley getting more optimistic. Matt Portillo, TPH's head of research. I know you wanted to share a couple of thoughts on what's happening in research and introduce another member of our team to talk about some recent developments.
As you probably noticed in the note, as well as on COBT, we've really been progressing our work around the energy transition process. And I think over the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to see a lot more research from TPH that really covers the broader renewable complex, the global power market, and then really anything and everything related to transportation. And it's all really melding into one thematic conversation that touches back on traditional oil and gas. And so we think it's quite important to keep our clients up to speed on our current thoughts on our traditional business, as well as where the future may be headed. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Matthew Blair, who heads up our chems and refining team, who recently launched on Darling. And maybe Matthew can provide a little bit of insight into the renewable diesel market.
Yes, we launched coverage on Darling Ingredients, the ticker is DAR, last week. It's a leading renewable diesel producer. Now, I think a lot of people have probably heard about biodiesel. Maybe you haven't heard about renewable diesel. So let me just go over, quickly some of the differences here. So both biodiesel and renewable diesel are produced using the same feedstocks. So that includes animal fats like tallow, It includes corn oil, soybean oil, even used cooking oil. But the production processes are different, and especially renewable diesel is essentially run through a refinery, run through a hydrocracker, run through a hydrotreater, and as a result, the end product is different. So renewable diesel, importantly, is a pure 100% drop-in substitute for diesel. You can blend up to 100% with no problems. That's in contrast to biodiesel, where when you start getting above 10%, you usually need some engine modifications. And then the other big difference is renewable diesel lasts forever. Biodiesel, it has a time shelf where it just doesn't last too long. So renewable diesel we view is really the future compared to biodiesel. Why were we interested in renewable diesel? Well, it's really taken off in California, and a large driver is California's low carbon fuel standard, or LCFS. And so as part of the program, higher carbon fuels like petroleum gasoline, petroleum diesel incur a deficit, and then lower carbon alternatives like biodiesel, renewable diesel, electricity for EVs incur credits through the program. And so as a result, renewable diesel in California has grown at a 40% CAGR over the past 5 years. Just remarkable growth. In 2015, renewable diesel held 4% share of the total California diesel market. Today, it's closer to 17%. And as a result, our refiners have really taken notice. So of our 8 refiners under coverage, 6 are pursuing renewable diesel projects. So it's really part of the growth story for the U.S. independent refiner set. Last thing I'll say is, Darling, we think is a pretty interesting stock here. And one thing that really makes this company unique in kind of a sea of new renewable diesel capacity is the legacy business here is animal rendering and used cooking oil collection. So they have a long history, over 100 years, of providing these sorts of services to restaurants and meat processors, slaughterhouses. And so as a result, Darling right now collects 40% of North America's used cooking oil. And under the California low carbon fuel standard, used cooking oil earns almost $1 per gallon. So we're talking $40 per barrel better margin compared to just like a generic soybean oil as a feedstock for renewable diesel. So that's a pretty significant comparative advantage in what's likely to be just a wave of new renewable diesel capacity hitting the market. I'll leave it there.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Matthew. I think it just illustrates we're unpacking new stuff every day about how the world is changing. So let's jump into the heart of today's show. Colin is going to be my joint book runner here as we try to corral what's going to be a lively conversation. Maybe just to kick it off, and thank you guys again for attending. We're very lucky to have friends like you guys, and so I can't thank you enough. Julian, you have some pages that WoodMac has done which just talk about the scope of the issue. Maybe to kick us off, could I ask you to say a few comments and maybe share some of those pages?
My energy colleagues are tired of hearing me say it, but the energy transition starts and ends with metals. And most people think about the energy transition and metals in the light of lithium and cobalt, but it's more than that. It is aluminum, it's copper, it's nickel, it's cobalt and lithium. Those are the main metals that are going to be used. And just to put it in context, there's a lot of talk about the 2-degree world, SDS or AET2 as we would call it as WoodMac. And our numbers suggest that for the copper industry, the aluminum industry, and the nickel industry, we need to more than double the world production of those metals to achieve a 2-degree world. In the case of lithium and cobalt, we need to increase supply by a factor of 5. The investment that we require is north of $1 trillion, which might not seem a lot compared to the energy space. But if you think about these metals, they are used to spending somewhere in the region of $25 to $30 billion a year in terms of capex. We're going to require that to increase to $100 billion a year every year for the next 10 years. So that's it kind of sets the scene in terms of the scale of the challenge. And last but not least, what I'll tell you is that if we're thinking about investing in these metals, price has to be the incentive. And with one exception, all those metals I'm talking about will have prices over the next 5 years between 30 and 40% below the incentive level. So how on earth are we going to be able to incentivize the development of supply?
And maybe let's start with that price signal, because I think as we were all listening to the numbers you gave, 5 times the amount of lithium, 5 times the amount of cobalt, twice the current amount of copper and aluminum, you would have assumed that you're projecting those prices are going to skyrocket. But you said just the reverse, and that's a problem. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Yeah, the problem we have is obviously coronavirus and the fact that demand has taken a down leg and the supply side of the equation hasn't adjusted to that lower demand set. So for each of those commodities I outlined, we are looking at a market that at best is balanced, but at worst is trending to significant oversupply. So take aluminum, we're looking at a 6 to 7 million ton stock build. And so what that means is that prices will be trending at or below marginal costs. And that's why we don't foresee prices being anywhere near incentive levels for at least the next 2 to 3 years. And then, of course, as the energy transition starts to accelerate and we start to really think about the pickup of EVs and decarbonizing the power generation and the grid, what then happens is the demand side takes off very, very rapidly. The supply side can't respond that quickly. 5 to 7 year lead times to develop mines at best. And it's that lag between the short cycle drivers and the long cycle supply development. The two just can't meet each other.
So for our oil and gas fans in the audience, there's no equivalent of lithium, cobalt, copper, aluminum, shale that you can quickly turn on and off. These are big projects, big mines, long lead times, etc.
Absolutely, yeah.
Dr. Eggert, as you hear all that, those flavors going up in these levels, I mentioned in the intro, you've been there at mines since 1986, so you've been thinking about minerals and metals for a long time. When you hear forecasts like that, what comes to mind? What do you think of as the issues, the concerns, or even the doability of that type of change?
Clearly, there are challenges on the supply side, but I guess I'm optimistic that over the longer term, markets will meet these challenges, but there will be short-term disruptions, and it's not the first time we will have seen short-term disruptions. Really, if one looks back, 50 or 100 years, every 10 to 20 years or so, there's a demand shock. That is, to a large degree, unanticipated by the market. It takes 5 to 10 years for the supply side to respond, but in the intervening period, you have a period of 2 to 7 to 10 to 15 years of really above trend prices. We saw that a decade ago. From roughly 2004 to 2014. We saw that in the 1970s. Some would argue that the entire period from World War II, peaking in the early 50s and then gradually declining by the early 70s. So broadly speaking, I'm optimistic, but in particular markets, there can be challenges. I think one of the opportunities that a challenge creates is the search for unconventional sources for many of these minerals. So it's rare earths from coal, it's rare earths from phosphate rock and fertilizer production waste streams. It's increasing the recovery of tellurium and indium from metallurgical processing of copper and zinc, for example.
Let me hit on the national security angle. I mentioned Secretary Fannin in the lead-in that you were helping look at the geopolitical implications of the energy transition. And I take it just to start, all these minerals are not located in Texas, darn it. We're going to be doing this in a lot of other places, and that has a lot of implications. And we're of course not the only country that has realized this. Some others may be competing with us. What would you tell us about the view from Washington on all this?
Well, firstly, the way in the context of the State Department, we will look at these energy issues from the geopolitical lens, really, whereas energy and resource issues are proxy for other foreign policy matters. The department's been working on energy in terms of the modern era, really specifically in the context of the oil crisis of the 1970s, where then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger helped catalyze the formation of the International Energy Agency, whose role was to create a degree of market resilience to ensure that countries, OECD countries in particular, would not be able to be easily fall victim to the market concentration of certain states, petrostates, in their relative market power. Now, I mention that because I was talking to Fatih Birol at IEA, and he came out and concluded that the relative market concentration of some of these minerals and mineral processing is far more significant than oil has ever been. That creates a degree, and the relative complexity of the supply chain to get to the final product, the electric vehicle, the battery, the wind turbine, what have you, is far more complex. And so it's not just a matter of just talking to countries and having stockpiles of oil. It's a far more complex situation. And so we're looking at through this lens of, especially given the demand for clean energy technologies globally, which I see, and I very much see as a bottoms-up demand. I know some will talk about Paris Climate Accord and kind of a bottoms or a top-down, but I see it really as a transitional call from a bottoms-up, given the scale of, we're going to have 2 billion more people in the middle class in the next 20, 30 years. These people have agency and they demand cleaner environments. So it's happening, but we're deeply concerned about the market concentration, and also in terms of the way in which some of these resources are where they're located, and what are the conditions that exploitation of resources are occurring. You mentioned I worked in the industry, and there are certain areas that the best-in-class private sector participants aren't going to go because of reputation or other risks. And unfortunately, that leaves those countries to the most predatory of actors. And that's a concern, because if they don't have an economic opportunity for their country, then either the world doesn't get the resources it needs, or it creates a second class of country where the local community isn't empowered, and they don't have an economic opportunity.
That's a great lead-in, Secretary Fannin. Mark, you're spent some time in Washington. You're in the Reagan administration at one point. You've been around. I bet you've had dinner with Henry Kissinger. Do you listen to this and say, yeah, this is just the natural bumps in the road when you completely transition from one way of doing something to another? Or do you look at it and say, what are we doing?
Well, let me, I think it's an unprecedented attempt at a transition that the world has never done. The world has never moved from cheaper, higher density energy to lower density, higher cost energy. It's never happened in the history of humanity. So it's an interesting and epic experiment. And I'm not sure it's going to work out so well, but I want to add to the Secretary's comments about geopolitics. Something he knows better than I do is the other feature of what's going on in this, quote, transition is the United States, which is, as all of you all know and your audience does, is a net exporter of natural gas and a roughly in balance, right, last year on oil, if you count export of refined products. So we're going to go from that posture, which supplies 2/3 of our energy, to a fully dependent state on energy materials, because we are not going to, and we do not have the supply base in production here. It's extremely unlikely to see it expand fast enough to do anything but have it dominated by imports. So we're going to reverse the geopolitics of this, and Henry Kissinger was the one that talked about realpolitik, right? And the soft power of where the United States resides on critical energy supply to the world as a swing producer is extraordinarily important in the dynamics of how negotiations happen. Much more important than hard power. Fighting with militaries is always your last resort. China knows that. They have extraordinary soft power and expanding in energy materials. So I think it's a geopolitical and strategic challenge of unprecedented proportions to do this. The second thing I'd say, which we heard my colleagues, is that we don't have the right price signals. I'm not an economist. I just play one on TV occasionally. So, but I would say, since we all know this in this group and your audience, there is no time in history when a commodity faces a dramatic increase in demand that price of the commodity collapses. The price of the commodity goes up, which is the price signal that the suppliers want to see, of course. And that price signal will last quite a while because it takes a long time to relieve the imbalance in demand and supply. The relevance of that, which is the elephant in the room here, is that every forecast of the future of these new sources of energy is expecting a decline in the costs of the technologies, especially batteries. Since 50 to 70% of the costs of these technologies, especially batteries, is commodity material input dominated, if we face the right price signal, we're not going to see declining costs. We're going to see rising costs, especially for batteries, which is the new fuel du jour. The last thing I'd add is another epic shift of significant relevance to the ostensible goal of the transition, which is, of course, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Roughly 2/3 of the world's energy is supplied by a liquid or a gas. Liquids and gases are really easy to move and store. They're very inexpensive to move and store, and they have a very low energy footprint in moving and storing. Pumping gas and oil in a pipeline, moving on, it's very cheap, low energy footprint. So we're going to switch from energy system dominated by liquids and gases to solids, which of course you don't put in pipelines, and you move with trucks, and you mine with oil. And, we heard at the outset, my colleague Julian said we're going to have to double roughly the biggest classes of mines in the world, copper and nickel, and we'll have to increase aluminum and steel, right? And not to mention concrete and cement. Well, the world's mining industry today uses roughly the same amount of oil as the global aviation industry did in January before the shutdowns. And it's not avoidable. I mean, if you want to mine more and move more of the stuff, you're going to create a rather interesting new vector for oil demand. And in fact, in a lot of scenarios that are done honestly, the net energy increase in mining, moving, and processing the materials totally wipes out the carbon dioxide savings from using the final product. So I guess I'd end with this. A lot of the proponents on this transition are either being dishonest, in my view, or they're being ignorant in the classic non-insulting sense of the word. They don't understand what they're actually proposing.
Let me ask Colin a question. We have this interesting situation where lithium, cobalt, copper, aluminum, trading below what seems to be the price necessary to, for the marginal cost. So we're not getting the price signal, but yet nobody disputes these minerals are going up, these metals are going up. Oil sort of has the same problem. It's $40, but yet we're looking at that $40 and a lot of people are interpreting that as, this is just not, we're just not gonna, this commodity has seen its best days. It's gonna decline for many years to come. And we heard Assistant Secretary Fannin reminded us all of the 2 billion people that are coming. So why are we looking at one commodity price and thinking one thing and looking at the other and thinking a different one?
It's interesting and curious that today the IEA has come out with a forecast for the next 30 years, the 2020 forecast. And as Mark just reminded us, Henry Kissinger and Realpolitik gave us the IEA in the first place to deal with a question of scarcity. And if you take seriously some of the projections in the more draconian scenarios that are outlined as scenarios by the IEA, many of us will not be allowed to take trips by car of 2 miles or less in the year 2050 through any technology. You'll just not be able to do it because you have to ration down the demand. And so I think what's interesting is twofold. One, we have to first make the decision of what kind of world we want to live in the year 2050. And so that begins to feed into the expected demand. But it would be somewhat foolish to overlook the lessons of commodity cycles that go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And for a range of scenarios, if demand's going to go up, and we are underinvesting today, I think we all agree the price does have to go up. And as it goes up, there's an opportunity for investors and a challenge for policymakers.
Dr. Eggert, if I could ask you, do you think your students are generally at the School of Mines is one of the great technical institutions on the planet? And of course, so many technologies are of interest and under study there. Is it widely appreciated that the energy transition is going to come with this massive increase in mining and what that might mean for, just as a student planning his or her career, or also just thinking through some of these issues? What would you say about that? Because it's a stunning amount of mining that needs to be done.
Well, I hope so. You're never quite sure as an instructor how effective you are. But I think
well, I knew that your students knew, but maybe I meant the whole student body.
No, I think it's not just me. It's one of the great things about the School of Mines is that even though we're a school known for science and engineering, we also have strong programs in mineral and energy economics and on issues related to ESG considerations in the extractive industries. And most of the people who are studying energy economics are in a program that also emphasizes mineral economics. And so for me, this is actually an ideal opportunity to be talking about the complementarity of mineral resources and energy. But clearly it's a story that needs to be told more widely. And the point that Mark makes about there are carbon emissions with raw material input extraction that have to be considered. And I think how that balances out, no one really knows, because I think it's a pretty understudied issue. What are the carbon emissions life cycle with the copper and the aluminum and the nickel that then support wind and solar?
Julian, maybe I could ask you, and then Colin, you've got to jump in here and drive because this is too much fun and I'm monopolizing. But when you're hanging out in the coffee room at Wood Mac, I guess it's the virtual coffee room now. You've got some of the best minds, best thinkers and forecasters on the planet. You guys have almost, I think it's 2,000 people globally. What's it like when you're trying to say, hey guys, we've got a supply, we have some constraints here. What's the debate like? I guess, do they say, Julian, you're spoiling the party. Stop talking about all this stuff. I'm teasing you.
Yeah, they've been saying that for 30 years, just by being there to spoil the party. But all jokes aside, the starting point is you guys are so, you're party poopers, because what you're forecasting is the demise of oil, ultimately. And hydrocarbons. And I say, yeah, okay, fine. Again, to a point that Colin made, society needs to decide what sort of world it wants to live in. And you can argue about climate change and the effect of carbon emissions, but again, you say, well, okay, let's assume we recognize that we need these metals. Okay, there's only two ways you can obtain these metals. You can either recycle. And again, that's a little bit under-researched, is the amount of material that goes to waste and we don't use as a resource. So some of this requirement of the energy transition can be fed by increased recycling rates. And China has a hell of a long way to go there. The US, Europe, Japan, high recycling rates. China is not even off the starting blocks yet. So that's one solution. It also kills two birds with one stone because it's very low carbon. So far as to tell you that the average emission from secondary aluminum is under a ton of carbon per ton. If you compare that with the average for China, And let's bear in mind that China supplies over 50% of the primary aluminum that the world uses. Their average carbon footprint is 20 tons. So for each ton of aluminum, they are emitting 20 tons of carbon. And the reason for that is primarily because they're using coal-based power. So unless you resolve that issue, you're achieving nothing. And again, and I'll leave one comment. If you're driving an EV in Canada using hydro energy, fantastic. Emissions at the tailpipe, nothing. If you're driving an EV in Poland or some of the Eastern European countries or China, in Poland they have 85% of their power generation is coal-based. So you're just shifting the pollution, you're achieving nothing. And in actual fact, you could argue you create even more pollution.
If I could follow up on that point about market concentration, Secretary Fannin, you made that point in your initial comments. And I notice on the president's list of critical minerals, there are 35, and 14 of them are not produced domestically. So if you could maybe just give us a little bit of a flavor on how the State Department thinks about that issue, that reality.
Well, the president's been, the administration kind of day one initially issued an executive order on the issue of critical minerals and it catalyzed a report. And then there's been successive work that the administration has been pursuing relative to that broad commander's intent, as it were. And then there was recently another EO on the issue. I think that the vulnerability that we have, but increasingly other countries are stepping up, and we're not alone. We, in terms of the State Department, some of the work that we're doing is leading on some bilateral and multilateral arrangements to help like-minded countries work together based on kind of shared principles. I guess I'd like to, one of those is an entity. We have a bilat with critical minerals with Australia. We have one with Canada. We have some other work we're pursuing with Japan. And so we have possibility of co-financing various projects around the world. One of the things that the U.S. is doing also in the State Department, we're leading on, is we recognize the United States is really a global leader in terms of mineral development over the long term. But we're not the only. We partnered with Canada, Australia, Botswana, and Peru, a diverse coalition of countries spanning 4 continents with different regulatory environments, histories, and we identified have our countries been effective over the long term in terms of responsible minerals development. And we formed an organization called the Energy Resources Governance Initiative. And together we've issued a toolkit which is open source, ergi.tools. You can go to it to help governments to understand how to ensure best practice to manage their own resource wealth, the resource endowment, come up with a geological survey, manage stewardship over the long term. So there's a toolkit out there to help these burgeoning, because given the scale of demand, and some of your other guests that spoke to this, the scale of demand is exponential. This will open up new frontiers for mining exploitation and increase the relative importance of existing basins. So we want to make sure that these new frontiers and the existing basins are able to attract best-in-class investors. That means they have to have the best-in-class conditions. So we're trying to help them do that. Secondly, we are funding countries to implement the toolkit. I mean, toolkit information, that's great, but if they don't have the capability to execute, then it's kind of, what's the point? Thirdly, coming from the private sector, the government often is great, but oftentimes is a latent indicator. What governments can do is establish regulatory constructs, but the private sector is the one who actually really gets after it. So we've integrated the ERGI principles into the Development Finance Corporation, which is a new entity that allows for the U.S. government to take equity stakes in projects to help catalyze private sector investment and de-risk projects. So we've integrated ERGI principles as a criteria for preference for some of that lending. Lastly, I'd really want to go back to this concept that a couple of the speakers have talked about, the market dynamics. And I just think we have to, back to this market concentration point, we don't have an actual market. the idea, not a market that the West can really understand, because the degree of transparency of pricing, of respect for all of the kinds of standards and conditions that Western companies follow, they're not being pursued. And so I do agree with the concept of how to change this price signal to integrate more readily some of the historic ESG issues into mineral development and processing and manufacturing, so that those companies and countries that do things the right way get a market premium for the sourcing. All of these clean energy technology companies, they're all claimed to be mission driven, right? They're not just out there to build a profit. They're effectively social change agents. And they have leaned into ESG activism in many instances. They care about where this stuff comes from. We just need to do more to provide a little bit of sunshine. And I think that will also help to create a global level playing field for responsible sourcing.
Well, Secretary Cannon, you've nailed it. Let the record reflect that at the 39-minute mark, ESG was introduced into the conversation. And I know that is Mark Mill's favorite topic. Mark, if I'm an oil and gas guy listening to all of this, I feel like part of me would be saying, hey, I'm really focused on ESG. I don't want any more methane leaks. I want to clean up everything I do. Isn't the oil and gas industry going to rightly ask, geez, there's a lot going on in this space that maybe ESG should focus on? What would be your thoughts on that?
Broadly speaking, in the Western world, people are much more interested in governance in all its sense, being responsive to priorities, social priorities, keeping the environment clean. I mean, there's no conflict in these things. The conflict is in that old adage of the devil's in the details. Well, what do you really mean? What is it exactly you're trying to achieve? And we can solve that through definitions that are clear. I want to emphasize on something Secretary Fannin said. I think that's really important. And I'm not raining on the parade that there's not going to be more mining and more green stuff. I mean, lithium batteries they got the Nobel Prize, 3 scientists got the Nobel Prize for lithium battery chemistry because it's an amazing technology. I mean, it's a step change better than anything that's happened since the invention of the battery. It's a big deal. So that's why there's a lot more batteries being used in the world, and there'll be a lot more in the future. So we're going to see lots more batteries, lots more solar arrays, lots more electric cars. I mean, that's not in dispute. I think the challenge is meeting the demand for the energy minerals is both a political problem, and I have to say it's great to see these initiatives coming in the United States, form these collaboratives, and to get best practices both funded and front and center. And it comes at a great time. I mean, I'm bullish on the fact, as you know, that the digitalization of the industrial ecosystem, in oil and gas and broadly is finally possible, right? We finally have the sensors and the software that can do meaningful things to give us more efficient extraction, production, and processing of large quantities of materials. It hasn't been possible up to now. We've had a lot of babble about digitalization, but it's very difficult. We're on the cusp of that now. So I'm actually very bullish about, in due course, meeting the market challenge. And I think, Dr. Ager is right. The market will respond to this. The technology happens to be ready to respond. But the idea that this is like a transition with a choice between a future with battery, wind, and solar and no oil and gas is silly. I mean, even the IEA's new forecast that Colin just mentioned just came out, I think it was yesterday or today. So it has their bullish scenario is 80% of net new electric supply will be wind and solar through 2030. It's actually not news. They've been saying something like that for a while, but they also say that the demand for oil in that same scenario goes up to 2030. Then it sort of plateaus and just slowly stays flat for a long time. 100 million barrel per day world is a very tough world to meet that supply. Never mind growth. It's going to be, and that's assuming this incredibly bullish scenario for more energy minerals and more wind, solar, and batteries. And they don't show any decline in natural gas use or plateauing for a very long time. It goes up. So we're sitting in this bizarre construct, especially students being told and a lot of politicians peddling this idea that there's a transition and a choice. It's not, I mean, I don't want to use the previous president's line, all the above, but it was actually a correct observation. We're going to use everything. We're going to see a lot of the other stuff. I just worry that, like the UN and like a bunch of EU bodies and like the World Wildlife Fund, a lot of the organizations that are finally woken up to the mineral demand implications and where the market will go, because it'll be easy to go to exploit, we'll call them the challenging regions in which we would not find BHP investing, but you're going to find a lot of other players investing, including China. And they're already doing that. And they'll flood the market with cheap, we'll call it compromised minerals. And it's damn hard to trace where the cobalt came from. It's not easy to tag the molecules. It's just not. And everyone knows that it's in the business. They get laundered. It's much easier to have conflict diamonds tracked because you can laser etch them. You can't laser etch a molecule of carbon or tellurium or praseodymium or dysprosium. It's just not going to happen. So it'd be great to see the United States be a leader in this. I think we can be, but we're going to somehow have to break the shackle that it's a choice between green stuff and no oil and gas. This is just in fact, how I feel about this. It's an infantile concept. It's really not. It'll never happen. That's not what the world's going to do.
So can I maybe just ask everybody? Never done this either. Just ask the whole crowd here, so anybody can either take it or we'll move on to the next question. But why don't we frame this climate discussion? Because we make it so complicated. There's so many variables. There's so many things. Why don't we just frame it as, how do we get the Chinese and the Indians to stop using so much coal? And why are we having a bilateral discussion with those guys to say, what do you want?
They want cheap power. It's about the money. That's
okay. So, but why aren't we, in the spirit of like Mark? I keep, thinking, Reagan and summits about nuclear weapons. Why hasn't the climate debate taken on a similar thing with the big economies at the table negotiating, on behalf of the world? Anybody want to?
I'll make a point on that. To be fair, China and the United States did do that in 2015, expressly with respect to coal. I think part of the problem is, here it is 5 years later, and most, if not all of us, have forgotten that happened. And so there has to be a consistency of follow through. And this amnesia effect, I think, is something you often see then spill into the university. So Rod, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, because you just reminded us that the copper cycle from 2004 to 2014 was a decade. I mean, it was something that many of us who were in markets at the time well remember. But if a student is at Mines today and they're 18 or 19 years old, talked about something that happened 16 years ago, was when they were in preschool, which is horrifying to me as I think about it. But these cycles, they come and they go. And in that 1999 to 2003 period leading up to 2004, we heard a lot of the same kind of things we hear about today, that the new economy, the soft economy, is going to replace the hard economy. And of course, all of these relative metrics, share of S&P, et cetera, often are because something else is skyrocketing, not necessarily because something is falling. So think of what's happening with Google relative to evaluation of an E&P company. So here's the question. When you're in the classroom and you can see the beginning of this buildup for the CapEx cycle starting yet again, and you explain that to the students, what's their response?
I think they're quite interested in it. Then one of the things I like to say is that we ought to be pretty humble about our ability to forecast, that we see the IEA scenarios, and even if we say they are scenarios and rely on these set of arguably plausible assumptions, someone interprets them as forecasts, and to forecast out 20, 30, 40 years, I think is a useful academic exercise, but we have to recognize that there's a significant amount of really technological uncertainty and technological competition. It's almost certainly true that lithium-ion batteries will be the battery of choice in EVs for the next 15 years, but beyond that, maybe not. There's a whole research industry kind of working in the background on beyond lithium, because lithium's not good enough, many would argue, to drive the EV revolution. To what degree is cobalt even used in lithium-ion batteries? There are multiple lithium-ion chemistries, and in some sense, the different lithium-ion battery chemistries are competing with one another. You have new sources, the primary mineral sources of, again, lithium, brines, hard rock, many parts of the world, many of them unable to raise capital at the moment, that in some sense are competing against recycling to capture that incremental unit of demand. So I think there's just a lot of uncertainty, and we need to be humble about our ability to forecast.
Is there one mineral in particular that would succeed across multiple scenarios? So taking that point that scenario is not forecast, forecast is not fact, but one mineral that perhaps stands out as particularly important across a range of scenarios?
Well, I think copper, to me, is most clearly satisfies that. Copper is going to be needed if electrification occurs. There are no good substitutes for copper in so many of its applications.
Matt, let me ask you, as a researcher, do you get, are investors interested? Do they see these trends? Do they ask you about these metals and minerals? And do you, as a research analyst, think about maybe I need to pay more attention to these? Maybe this is these are companies, a sector that we should look at more closely.
Yeah, Maynard, I think it's really one of the quintessential questions that we get on this topic, which is really around EV adoption moving forward. And is there a point at which EVs can reach ICE parity? And in a world where we've seen significant subsidies from China to Europe to the US, we're generally seeing penetration rates, and take the US as an example, at about 2% of new sales. So even with that subsidized market, we still need to invest significantly in infrastructure expansion. And then at some point, these need to be unsubsidized opportunities to compare an ICE vehicle versus an electric vehicle. And really coming back to the broader topic here, the minerals and metals going into those batteries are really going to play a key role. And if there's a shortage around that, then there's definitely a risk that as the industry started to forecast out mid-decade ICE parity, that things get pushed to the right, and there's a bigger issue with adoption moving forward. So it's a big unknown, but I think it's extremely important to really fundamentally work on, and it's something as a research platform we'll be digging into more readily here over the next few quarters.
If you want to know how the market responds, and responds very quickly, if you think about what happened last year, so with EVs in China, okay, so EV sales dropped, nobody foresaw that, but also what you saw is you saw a shift out of high nickel ternary battery chemistries to lithium iron phosphate. Why? Because it's cheap. Okay, and there's no cobalt in there, there's no nickel. Okay, so we shouldn't underestimate the ability of consumers to innovate out if we cannot develop the supply. And I think that's the underlying message. And to pick up on what Dr. Eggert's said about materials and the fact that we've got, and we're back to the Donald Rumsfeld isms, we know what we know, we don't know what we don't know. So 15 years out, who knows what battery chemistries there are? We haven't even talked about hydrogen, as a potential solution here, but maybe that's for a different call. So the industry will innovate. If we don't develop the supply in a timely manner at the right cost, it'll be innovated out.
It's funny, one of Rumsfeld's other fun quotes was, if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. And that feels like what we've done here. Maybe Mark, you'll help me with my history, but I was thinking about Dr. Eggert's point about innovation and how it could change all this. Wasn't it Alan Greenspan in the 90s was saying, every policy we have encourages more natural gas use and less natural gas drilling. So we're kind of headed for this, like, what are we doing? And sure enough, gas in the early part of the century, it reached $15 an M. But today, through innovation, look what we did. Is there a similar thing happening here that's going to solve a lot of these problems?
I think the answer is yes, but not quite as dramatically, because and I think it was Dr. Egger said there's no, maybe you said it, there's no shale field of dysprosium. There's no shale field of copper, right? I mean, the challenge here is that the innovation that's needed is in how we dig lots of rock out of the earth and crush it and dissolve the rocks and get to the minerals. That technology has got incrementally better. It's getting better all the time, but the big step functions are going to come from machine learning and AI and sensors, but they won't come quickly. They won't come overnight. These are just like the oil and gas business. It's very difficult in these big physical industries with big capital projects, which involve hardware that's large and where lives are at risk if you do something stupid or wrong, that you move quickly. They move slowly. Yeah, history will look back 50 years from now and look like a switch was flipped, but it won't feel that way for the next half century. So we're in an exciting world of rapid technology change in terms of what we do with information. The velocity of change in hardware hasn't changed for a century. And despite all this babble about how the accelerating pace of change, we haven't seen that. If we trace lithium batteries invention, the chemist that discovered it was an Exxon chemist in New Jersey, right, in the early 80s. In fact, it was late 70s, in fact. We didn't get commercial lithium battery until the early 90s, and we didn't get batteries that were useful to scale we're talking about today for another 20 years. I mean, these are long cycles. If a new chemistry is invented that's commercially viable for a battery, 20 years it gets to commercial proof, 20 more years it gets to scaling. It's not irrelevant, but it's totally irrelevant to market makers and commodities in the short term. By short term, I mean like 2+ decades to 3 decades. So the mining industry has these two big challenges. The Secretary talked about how opaque the industry is. Boy, it's compared to oil and gas. I mean, it's unbelievably opaque. The price transparency is a disaster. You have no idea what people are really paying. You don't know what it really costs for so many of these resources, especially if they're in odd parts of the world with so many private companies that are secretive and so many state-funded companies. So we have no price transparency. We have low velocity because we're talking D9s. We're talking giant backhoes. We're not talking about downloading an app at high velocity. So there's a lot of naivete about how fast this stuff is going to move. And the consequence of the slow motion is, another price cycle, and which by definition means higher prices. And that will stimulate innovation, and students and people will get excited, but consumers won't be happy. And the buyers of electric cars won't be happy, because the idea that cost of the battery will be co-equal the cost of an internal combustion engine depends on the materials.
I guess a couple of points. You mentioned the Greenspan point, and I think that was in 2002, and he was testifying in the Senate. I was serving in the Senate as to the Senate Environment Committee, and was conducting oversight hearings about this very question, because at the time gas prices were so high, we were seeing manufacturing dislocation in the United States.
Yes.
For offshoring for petrochem in places like Germany because it was cheaper. That was in 2002. And then in 2005, we passed the Energy Policy Act, which included a hydraulic fracturing provision, which effectively was an instance of tort reform, which created a degree of clarity for the industry that the U.S. EPA was not going to regulate this practice. It was going to continue to be regulated by the states. And that's a signal to the innovators to get after it. And then 2008, the shale revolution was born. Going back to this instance, we don't have that degree, that engine of innovation in the market driver, that signal, because of the market concentration that's being dominated by a few jurisdictions and by the market dominance of China. And, part of the consumer preference, and China's the biggest EV market, and they're pushing, the non-nickel cobalt battery. It's also a range anxiety issue, but also as a reflection of after Indonesia decided that they were going to ban nickel exports because they wanted to create a domestic smelting industry. And you know, the DRC tripled the government take of cobalt a few years ago. Prices went up 300%. And you know, so this issue of market concentration can happen all the time. Of course, we have the famous or infamous example of China and rare earths in 2010. And that's often referenced in the literature, but rarely does someone go back and say, well, what was the cause for their ban? The cause the Chinese was because Chinese fishing trawlers went into Japanese waters illegally, and Japan seized the vessel, and that was the response, a completely unassociated to the issue of minerals and demand. It was a wholly geostrategic issue. So back to this market concentration, some of the work that we're looking to do is how do we catalyze working with like-mindeds to create a proper market that recognizes and integrates some of these issues about that we all kind of value in the West, so that they are incorporated and the price is reflected accordingly, and we create some transparency in terms of the existing market. And we're seeing some positive. You know, I'm heartened that LG Chem is building a big facility in the United States. They're doing it because it makes good sense, because batteries are really heavy and they're hard to export. I'm pleased to see rare earth elements, you know, part and parcel of the U.S. government. This administration is funding support for domestic industries, but we need the similar. These are all supply focused. We need the demand signal as well, and so that's a lot of the charge we're moving forward with, talking to companies as well as countries to help create that demand signal, create that preference. I'll stop. Thanks.
Well, look, this feels like the holidays. I hate it when the unwrapping presents is over. I start to feel sad. We've unwrapped so many presents today. But maybe I could just throw out something, and we'll get each of you to just a comment either on what I'm going to throw out or your own takeaway from today, because I know our audience wants to hear more from you guys. But it seems like when you listen to this and you talk about supply constraints and you talk about some of the national security issues or the human rights issues or the market concentration issues, or you talk about how innovation is going to continue to change this equation, almost everything we touch on makes me, if I'm a country or a company or an automaker, you know, you pick it, I look at all this and say, you know what, I want to hedge my bets. I want to stay in ICE and I want to get into EVs. I want to keep my oil and gas, but I want to grow this new stuff. You know, I want to find balance. I want to develop some of these markets, but I got to keep my domestic supply chains intact because, you know, we just saw it in the coronavirus, supply chains got disrupted. It's a big issue. So I'm looking for a hedge because I don't know what's going to happen. That feels like good planning. Like your all of the above comment, Mark. But that's a takeaway I have. Do you guys share that, or what is the takeaway you have, if you could, from each of your angles, just kind of summarizing this? And Julian, I might just start with you.
Sure. Well, if you want a single hedge, and it's been mentioned before, it's copper. You're going to need copper for everything.
I'll just buy copper and stay home. Well, copper and natural gas, that was last week's show. So copper and natural gas will be winners, and we'll all just get together and have sandwiches and mineral water.
But that's the easy answer. But what I would say is that, and it echoes the point that Secretary Fenton said, we need partnerships. We need government to de-risk supply. If I think about the analogy I draw is rare earths, think battery raw materials, because China is dominating, and unless we get our act together through joint ventures, de-risking, partnerships and development, China will own that battery raw materials supply chain. And who would bet against a trawler from country X going into the wrong waters, and the trawler being lifted, and China saying, you know what, we're going to switch off battery raw materials supply? I
mean, sorry, but if you're China, doesn't this look geopolitically like it plays to your favor? Absolutely. The more oil and gas is diminished, and the more all of this, I make solar, I can operate in difficult countries, you know, all of this stuff. Doesn't this for China?
No, absolutely. It plays very much into China's hands. So appetite for risk, much greater. Appetite for lower returns, much greater. ESG issues, a bit patchy. Human rights issues, a bit patchy. So it very much plays into China's hands. And also, the strategic imperative for China is to wean itself on reliance of imported oil. So it's switching that reliance for security of battery raw material.
I see. Dr. Egger, let you try to make some sense of this for us. What is your takeaway from all this?
Maybe one statement and one idea for a new show or another show.
Okay, fantastic.
Rephrase what you just said. I think a lot of people are replacing the philosophy of just in time, seek the lowest cost, minimize your inventory costs, replace just in time with just in case. The idea that there are some supply chain vulnerabilities that it's worth having a mitigation strategy or an insurance policy, so to speak, for. The discussion that we really haven't hit directly on today, but Assistant Secretary Fannin broached, is this question of what's the appropriate role for government. For many years, number of decades in the United States, and many other parts of the Western world, there's been what's called a neoliberal approach to public policy, that government's role is to establish the framework in which private sector activities occur. We don't pick winners or losers. We don't target specific sectors. Now, there always have been exceptions to that, even in the United States, but there seems to be a growing interest in acceptance for industrial policy with respect to these critical raw materials, where there are targeted efforts at rare earths or battery materials. And what do we think about this neoliberalism versus targeted industrial policy as in more philosophical discussion of what's the role for government?
That's a great point. Colin, let me get you in here.
As I listen to the conversation, I'm reminded of the old saw that people who don't learn from the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them. And, I think that it's really very, very crucial that we do learn from the past about some of these geosecurity considerations in particular, because a fishing trawler that leads to an exaggerated response, perhaps, from the Chinese is one example of how there's some asymmetry in these policy responses. But the past is filled with examples where soft power becomes hard power real fast. And the history of commodity markets is intimately tied to warfare. I don't want to be alarmist, but when these sort of numbers begin to appear in the historical record, total import dependency, zero production, wars are fought over resources. And if there is another pandemic 15 years from now, if there is something serious in the socioeconomic sphere, we would be well placed today to begin to take seriously some of the points that Assistant Secretary Fannin is trying to teach us about having those calming mechanisms in place before you need them.
Secretary Fannin, I'm going to let Mark wrap us up. But as you heard Dr. Egger talking about the role of government, when Colin was talking, I'm imagining the version of Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. One of the DRC's neighbors just decides, I'm coming over, and it creates a huge problem. I mean, surely things like that are, unfortunately, now we have to be on our radar. But I'm leading the witness. You were so gracious to attend and right there in Washington thinking about all these issues. How would you sum up today?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I guess, China's been mentioned quite a bit, and clearly they're increasingly dominant in this space and in all parts of the value chain. And I think we go back to, and some of the other participants noted that China's general geostrategic priority is to no longer be dependent on the U.S. protectorate of sea lanes for oil shipments. I agree. What I'm also looking at, I think Colin made the comment about history repeating itself and gave me that caution. In that light, I think I've studied quite a bit why China today dominates the solar PV industry, and by designating a strategic industry, heavily over-subsidizing, oversupplying it, creating overcapacity, having European countries want to increasingly green themselves. Fukushima happened in 2011, catalyzing that effort. U.S. gas wasn't a thing yet. That happened in 2016. And there was cheap China solar. And now I'm looking at the COVID response, the Green Deal in Europe, creating a potential artificial catalyst for that. We need to care about how these products, which have a positive environmental outcome on the end use, but we have to be mindful of how they are produced along the entirety of the value chain. That's a lot of the work that we're trying to do. China is not interested in environmental outcomes, but they do tend to spend the most. Those are not the same thing. If it is all about greenhouse gas emissions, then we should recognize China for the biggest polluter that it is. Roughly 50% of global emissions are China. China's domestic industry, as well as their Belt and Road coal development. So their focus on clean energy technologies is wholly focused on their geostrategic imperative, not focused on environmental outcomes. We need to increase our partnerships with like-mindeds, as well as Europe, who is catalyzing this transition call. Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like we came in with a metals and minerals idea, and we're leaving China. I mean, China just a dominant flavor. Matt, before I go to Mark, anything you'd add?
Yeah, Maynard, I think I'd bring it back to the transportation sector. And China and Europe have policies in place that are rapidly transforming the auto fleet from an electrification standpoint. And in some cases, that is a subsidy-driven system. And in some cases, that is pressure on the supply chain, especially at the OEM level, to meet mandates moving forward. What's interesting is that policy seems to start to influence the U.S. OEMs as well, because it is a global market. And so I think the big question clients have had over the next 12 to 24 months is how the U.S. Sees the evolution of the EV market, and ultimately what that means from a policy and impact perspective. Because as China and Europe move forward, and that's about a 43 million vehicle per year market, they do have big influences on our auto manufacturers as well. And we definitely see a real opportunity here for the U.S. to participate. But we're going to need to see, potentially, as we mentioned, a lot of investment moving forward to potentially change how that fleet dynamic looks. So I'll turn it over maybe to Mark, and Mark can give us some final thoughts here.
China's the right place to end on metals and minerals for all the reasons that everyone understands here. But let me modify, because I think the real important question is the one that Dr. Egger raised, what's the government's role? I mean, the government always has a role, whether you're a Reagan child like I was, an infant in the Reagan White House science office, whether, you don't have to be a conservative or a liberal not to know that the government has a role. The question is, when it comes to industrial policy, there are implicit and explicit roles. When it comes to mining, and specifically, we're talking about this is a mining business. The United States has had a policy. It's had a policy to discourage mining. I mean, you've talked to any miner, and I've talked to secretary's been in that business. I used to be in a mining company. Talk to mining investors, talk to mining companies on what it takes to get permits in the United States to open a new mine. We have had an affirmative policy. It's to drive mines out of America and let them be developed elsewhere. If we want to have more mines here, we don't have to favor them in the sense of hand them checks. We have to get out of the way in the old Reagan line. Doesn't mean you don't have regulations. Doesn't mean you don't have environmental permits. It means you can't be having people take 15 years to get permits. Some permits have taken 2 decades or 3 decades. It is untenable and unacceptable. Maybe we have, I'll end on a positive note, possibly with the combination of worries about China and the supply chain, the pressure on ESG to have more green minerals, to have more electric cars manufactured in America, all those three converge to maybe we can get out of that accelerated permitting and help American investors open up mines. We got lots of resources in this country.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Egger from the School of Mines, we just want to say thank you to you, Assistant Secretary Pannon at State Department, for so honored. Julian from Woodmac, thank you, and Mark from the Manhattan Institute. This was absolutely what we thought it would be. It was a powerhouse. I think it pointed to Dr. Eggert's philosophical question. The world needs better leadership. You need more leadership the more complicated it gets. And so let's end with a collective call for better leadership and better understanding out there.